A terrified girl emerged from the fog, screaming that her mother was hanging from a tree, stopping a convoy of black luxury cars dead in their tracks. She didn't know she had just flagged down Dominic Thorne, a ruthless crime lord, but instead of driving away, he led his men into the woods to cut the woman down. Now the men who tortured this family are about to learn that the forest has a new apex predator. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The fog came in low that morning, rolling across the forest road like something with intention. It swallowed the pavement in thick gray waves, muffling sound and turning the towering pines into dark silhouettes that could have been watching or sleeping. The air tasted of damp earth and moss cold enough to sting the lungs. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound until she appeared. The little girl materialized from the mist like a ghost taking shape. Her dusty rose dress was torn and streaked with mud that looked almost black in the dim light. She ran barefoot down the center of the road, her arms pumping frantically, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore from her chest like something being ripped apart. She wasn't jogging. She wasn't playing. She was running for her life. Her feet slapped against the wet asphalt, leaving bloody prints that vanished into the fog behind her. Her dark hair hung in tangled ropes across her face, and when she stumbled, catching herself on trembling hands before pushing upright again, the sound of her palms hitting pavement echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Her name was Wren Holloway. She was 8 years old, and 30 minutes ago she had watched 4 masked men string her mother up from an oak tree and leave her hanging like a warning sign in the middle of nowhere. Wren ran until she saw them. 2 black luxury cars sat in formation across both lanes, engines idling with the deep purr of expensive machinery. They blocked the road completely as if they'd been waiting for something, or someone. Chrome gleamed through the mist. Tinted windows reflected nothing but gray. The vehicles looked like they'd been carved from shadow and steel. Wren didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down. She ran straight toward them, her voice breaking the morning open like a stone through glass. "Help!" The word ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. "Please, someone help." The door of the lead car opened. A man stepped out with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to absolute control. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit with a black shirt beneath. No tie. The suit jacket hung open, revealing intricate tattoos that covered his chest and crawled up his neck in bold patterns, symbols and script that told stories most people wouldn't want to read. More ink decorated both his hands, visible even from a distance. His dark hair was slicked back, his face composed and unreadable. He looked dangerous in the way expensive things often are. Quietly, completely, without apology. His name was Dominic Thorne, and in certain circles, that name carried weight that could crush bones. Behind him, 2 more car doors opened in synchronized silence. 3 men emerged, each wearing dark suits with white shirts and ties, as each moving with the same disciplined precision. They spread out naturally, hands resting near concealed weapons, eyes scanning the fog-choked tree line with the practiced vigilance of soldiers who'd seen enough combat to trust nothing. These were not bodyguards. They were an extension of Dominic's will muscle and reflex and loyalty pressed into human shape. The little girl stumbled toward Dominic, her legs finally betraying her. She collapsed to her knees 3 feet from his polished shoes. Mud splashed across the pavement. Her hands shot out toward him, fingers curled like claws, and the words tumbled out between gasps, so violent her small body convulsed with each one. "They hung my mom on a tree." She sobbed, barely able to form the syllables. "Please, you have to save her. Please." Dominic looked down at her without moving. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach out. He simply studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing. The rope burns circling her thin wrists like brutal bracelets. The way her entire body shook with exhaustion and terror that had been running through her veins for too long. The dirt under her fingernails from clawing at something. Or someone. One of his men stepped forward. "Boss," Dominic raised one hand. Silence fell instantly. Wren's sobs filled the void, desperate and broken, the sound of a child who had screamed until screaming wasn't enough, and now could only weep. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking into fragments. "She's still there." They left her hanging. "Please," Dominic tilted his head slightly. still watching her, calculating, reading the situation the way a surgeon reads an x-ray. The child wasn't hysterical. She was traumatized. There was a difference. He'd seen enough of both to know. Where his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying no emotion whatsoever. Just a single word that cut through the morning like a blade. Ren lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the forest, toward a wall of trees that disappeared into fog so thick it looked solid. In there, not far, I ran. I ran so fast. Her voice broke completely. She doubled over, pressing her muddy forehead against the cold pavement, and the sound she made wasn't crying anymore. It was something deeper, something that comes from the place where a child's understanding of safety has been permanently shattered. Dominic glanced at his men. No words were spoken. None were needed. The engines shut off one by one. Car doors closed with soft, final clicks. The three men moved into formation around Dominic without being told, hands now resting openly on weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Dominic looked down at the child again. Stand up. Ren struggled to her feet, swaying dangerously, her legs shaking so badly her knees knocked together. Dominic caught her elbow, not gently but not roughly either. He steadied her the way you'd steady a structure that was about to collapse. She stared up at him with wide, red-rimmed eyes that held more hope than any child should ever have to place in a stranger, especially a stranger like him. You lead, Dominic said simply. We follow. Ren nodded frantically, already turning toward the forest. She took 3 steps before her legs buckled again, and this time Dominic didn't wait. He lifted her effortlessly, settling her against his side with one arm. She weighed almost nothing, 80 pounds of terror and courage wrapped in a muddy pink dress. Hold on, he said. Not a suggestion, a command. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. He felt her tears soaking through his expensive suit jacket, warm against the cold morning air. He ignored it. Fabric could be replaced. The look in a child's eyes when they'd lost all hope could not. Dominic moved toward the tree line, his men falling into tactical formation around him. Leon, his most trusted operative, took point. Garrett and Brennan flanked, wide weapons, drawn eyes sharp. They entered the forest as a single unit, swallowed immediately by fog and shadow, and the road behind them went silent again, as if the world had closed a door. The trail Ren directed them down was barely visible, more animal path than human road. Branches clawed at their suits like skeletal fingers. Roots tried to trip them with every step. The fog grew thicker, pressing close like something alive and curious, something that wanted to watch what happened next. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many steps. Dominic felt Ren's heartbeat slamming against his chest, a frantic percussion that matched the increasing tension in the air. His men moved silently, the weapons raised, eyes scanning every shadow between every tree. They knew this feeling. They'd walked into ambushes before. But this was different. This felt heavier, wronger, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the trees pulled back. The forest opened suddenly like curtains, revealing a stage and a clearing lay ahead. Circular, unnaturally empty, and in its center stood a massive oak tree, ancient and gnarled, its branches spreading wide like the arms of something passing judgment on everything beneath it. Hanging from those branches, swaying slightly in a breeze that didn't exist anywhere else in the forest, was a woman. Ren screamed. The sound pierced the clearing like a siren, raw and primal, the cry of a child seeing her worst nightmare confirmed in daylight. Dominic's grip on Ren tightened, and his other hand moved to his weapon. His eyes swept the tree line, checking for threats, for movement, for anything that suggested this was a trap rather than a crime scene. Nothing moved except the woman on the rope. Check her, he said quietly. Leon sprinted forward. He was a former military operative whose hands had performed more violence than most people could imagine. But as he pressed 2 fingers against the woman's neck, searching for a pulse beneath cold gray skin, those same hands trembled. She's alive, he called back, his voice tight. Barely. Dominic shifted Ren in his arms, turning her face away from the sight of her mother hanging limp against the ropes that had cut deep furrows into her wrists. Don't look, he said quietly. It was an order, not comfort. Ren buried her face deeper into his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs that had no sound left in them. She'd screamed herself empty somewhere between the oak tree and the road, and now all that remained was silent trembling, the body's way of processing horror when the voice has given up. Dominic's other 2 men moved with immediate precision. Garrett pulled a tactical knife from his belt and began scaling the tree with the efficiency of someone who'd done harder climbs under worse conditions. Brennan positioned himself beneath the woman's arms, raised ready to catch her weight the moment the ropes were cut. Dominic watched them work his mind, already 3 steps ahead. Whoever had done this wasn't far. Rope burns on Wren's wrists meant she'd been restrained too, forced to watch. The fresh mud on her dress meant she'd fallen multiple times while running, which meant adrenaline had carried her farther than her small body should have been able to go. The terror in her eyes meant the men who'd hung her mother were the kind who made examples. Not idle threats, not warnings, examples. They were still close. They had to be. How long, Dominic asked Wren, his voice low and even. How long ago did they leave? Wren lifted her head slightly, confusion crossing her tear-streaked face. What? The men who did this. How long ago did they leave? Wren's eyes went distant, trying to process time through the fog of trauma. I don't know. Not long, maybe. Maybe they're still. Her voice cracked like thin ice under weight. They said they'd come back. They said if anyone tried to help, they'd... They're not coming back, Dominic interrupted. His tone was flat and final, carrying the certainty of someone who didn't make predictions. He made promises, and his promises had a way of becoming permanent. Above them, Garrett's knife sawed through the thick rope with deliberate care, each stroke controlled precise, designed to lower rather than drop. Ready, he called down to Brennan. Go. The rope parted with a sound like a sigh, like the tree itself was releasing something it had been forced to hold. The woman's body dropped, and Brennan caught her with surprising gentleness, for a man his size, lowering her immediately to the damp ground. Leon was beside her in seconds, checking vitals, assessing damage with hands that moved like a doctor's, despite belonging to a man who specialized in causing harm. Pulses weak but steady. Leon reported his fingers moving from her neck to her wrists, examining the deep rope burns that had cut into flesh so severely the white of bone gleamed through in places. Possible hypothermia, definite shock. She needs medical attention now. No hospitals, Dominic said immediately. All 3 men looked at him. They knew better than to question out loud, but the silence itself carried weight. Dominic set Wren down gently, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her. She immediately tried to run to her mother, but he held her back with quiet firmness. Not yet. Let them work. But she's alive because we got here in time. She stays alive if you let my men help her. Dominic's dark eyes held the girl's gaze with an intensity that most adults couldn't withstand, but Wren didn't look away. She stared right back at him, this small, battered child searching the face of a dangerous stranger for something she desperately needed to find. Trust me or don't, Dominic said. But if you trust me, you listen. Wren swallowed hard and nodded. Her small hand gripped Dominic's jacket so tightly, her knuckles went white, and she didn't let go. Wouldn't let go. That hand on his jacket became an anchor, the only thing keeping her from flying apart into pieces too small to reassemble. Dominic pulled out his phone with his free hand, dialing without looking at the screen. The call connected on the first ring. I need a medical team. Woman mid-30s. Exposure rope trauma, possible shock. Discrete location, 20 minutes. He paused, listening to whatever voice responded on the other end. No, not the clinic. The safe house on Riverside, full surgical prep. He ended the call and pocketed the phone, his attention returning to his men with the seamless efficiency of a machine shifting gears. Garrett had descended from the tree and was examining the surrounding area with a predator's focus, reading the forest floor like a book written in disturbed leaves and broken branches. He crouched near the edge of the clearing, touching the earth with practiced fingers. Boss, he called quietly. Tracks, fresh, 4 men, heavy boots, heading northeast. Dominic's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Leon caught it. Leon always caught it. How fresh, Dominic asked. Garrett pressed deeper into the soft earth, feeling the moisture content of the disturbed soil. Minutes, they could still be within a quarter mile. The air in the clearing changed. All 3 men felt the shift, a transition from rescue operation to something colder, sharper, something they knew better than anything else in the world. The hunt. But Dominic's eyes went to Wren first. Your mother? What's her name? Grace, Wren whispered. Grace Holloway. Grace is going to be fine. My men will take care of her. But I need you to stay here with Leon while... No. Wren's grip on his jacket became desperate. her small fingers twisting the fabric with strength born from terror. "Don't leave me, please. They'll come back. They said they would. They won't come back," Dominic said again. And this time, there was something in his voice that made the promise sound less like reassurance and more like a death sentence intended for someone else. "I'm going to make sure of that." He gently pried Ren's fingers from his jacket and guided her to Leon, who had removed his own suit jacket and draped it over Grace's unconscious form. The child looked impossibly small standing next to Leon's substantial frame, her bloody feet leaving prints on the forest floor, her eyes wide and ancient, with the kind of knowledge no 8-year-old should possess. "Stay with your mother," Dominic instructed. "Leon will keep you both safe. If anyone comes who isn't us, he'll handle it." Leon met Dominic's eyes and nodded once. His hand moved to rest on the weapon at his hip. The gesture was casual automatic, but the meaning was absolute. Dominic turned to Garrett and Brennan. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The three men moved as one toward the northeast trail, leaving Leon crouched between Ren and her mother like a suited guardian with a gun and a mandate that left no room for interpretation. Ren watched them disappear into the fog, her voice barely a whisper. "Where's he going?" Leon checked Grace's pulse again, his expression carefully neutral. "To send a message." "What kind of message?" Leon was quiet for a long moment, listening to the forest. In the distance, through the thick fog and ancient trees, he thought he heard voices raised in surprise. Then a sharp sound. Then nothing at all. "The permanent kind," he said finally. Ren didn't understand. Not fully. But as she curled up beside her other's still form, feeling the faint rise and fall of Grace's chest beneath the suit jacket, some part of her, the part that had run barefoot through a nightmare, and somehow found exactly the right dangerous man to trust, understood enough. The forest had swallowed Dominic Thorne and his men like they'd never existed. But the forest would remember what came next. Leon worked in silence, his hands moving with practiced efficiency over Grace's cold body. He'd seen worse. Much worse. He'd pulled men from wreckage, carried wounded soldiers through desert heat, held pressure on wounds that shouldn't have been survivable, but somehow were. But something about finding a woman strung up like a scarecrow in the middle of nowhere made his jaw clench harder than usual. Ren sat pressed against his side, her dusty rose dress still damp with mud and morning dew. Her eyes were locked on her mother's face with the intensity of someone who believed that looking away, even for a second, might cause the person to stop breathing. Grace Holloway's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look more ghost than human. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular rhythms that Leon didn't like. Shallow meant the body was conserving. Irregular meant the systems were struggling to coordinate. Both together meant time was a factor he couldn't control. "Is she going to wake up?" Ren's voice was small, scraped raw from screaming. It sounded like it belonged to someone much older, someone who had been tired for years rather than hours. Leon pulled a thermal blanket from the pack he always carried, standard field kit, and spread it over Grace, tucking it carefully around her shoulders, her arms, her battered wrists. "She will. But not yet." Her body shut down to protect itself. "It's trying to recover." "From what?" Leon hesitated. "How did you explain to a child what suspension from a tree by your wrist for hours did to the human body? The way circulation cut off in stages. How muscles screamed and then went silent. How the mind fractured under sustained agony, splintering into pieces that might take months or years to reassemble if they ever did. From being very scared for a very long time," he said finally. Ren nodded slowly, accepting this answer because she understood fear now. Intimately, personally, she'd lived inside it for hours that felt like years, breathed it, like air felt it replace her blood with something colder and thicker that made her limbs heavy and her thoughts sharp in ways that hurt. "Why did they do it?" Her voice was barely audible. "My mom didn't hurt anybody. She works at the diner. She brings me to school. She reads to me before bed. She does voices for all the characters, different ones, even the dragons." Her voice cracked on the word dragons, and the innocence embedded in that detail. A mother making dragon voices at bedtime hit Leon harder than any bullet he'd ever taken. Why would someone hang her from a tree? Leon had no good answer. In his experience, cruelty rarely needed justification beyond the simple fact that some men enjoyed wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. Cruelty was its own motivation, its own reward. But he couldn't say that to a child whose world had been shattered and rearranged into something she no longer recognized. Some people are broken inside, he said instead, and broken people break things. Ren processed this with the unsettling thoroughness of a child who has been forced to grow up between sunrise and sunset. Is Mr. Thorne broken? Leon's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a more perceptive question than he'd expected from an 8-year-old, though perhaps he should have expected it. Children who survived trauma developed a radar for damage in others. They learned to read adults the way sailors learn to read weather, not from curiosity, but from the necessity of survival. Why do you ask? Because he didn't smile. Not even once. And his eyes. Ren struggled to find the words, her small forehead creasing with the effort of articulating something she could feel but couldn't name. They looked empty. Like nobody's home. Like the lights are on, but the house is hollow. Leon checked Grace's pulse again. Still weak. Still there. Still fighting. He considered how to answer a question that didn't have a simple response. Dominic Thorne was many things. Dangerous, certainly. Powerful, absolutely. Ruthless when circumstances demanded it, which was often. Loyal to those who earned it, which was rare. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, constructed it brick by brick from violence and strategy, and an understanding of human nature that bordered on clinical. But broken. That was complicated. Mr. Thorne isn't empty, Leon said carefully. He's careful. He's seen a lot of bad things and he's done what he needed to do to survive them. That changes a person. Doesn't make them hollow. Just makes them quiet. Did it change you? Leon met the little girl's eyes and saw a sharpness there that survival had honed like a blade on a whetstone. She wasn't asking to make conversation. She genuinely wanted to understand the architecture of the men who had materialized from the fog to save her mother, because understanding them meant understanding whether she was truly safe or just temporarily sheltered. Yes, he admitted, it did. But you still helped us. Yes. So maybe Mr. Thorne isn't broken. Maybe he's just... Ren searched for the word, turning it over in her mind like a stone she'd found on a beach. Careful, like you said. Leon almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around his mouth twitched, considered the motion, and decided against it. Smiling felt inappropriate in a clearing where ropes still hung from a tree, and a woman's blood had soaked into ancient roots. Maybe, he said. A sound cut through the forest, distant but distinct. A shout, then another, then the unmistakable crack of something that might have been a branch snapping or might have been something else entirely. Something sharper, something final. Ren tensed, her hand shot out and gripped Leon's arm with surprising strength. What was that? Mr. Thorne, Leon said simply. His hand moved to rest on his weapon, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. His eyes scanned the tree line, cataloging every shadow, every shift in the fog, every branch that might have moved when it shouldn't have. Is he okay? He's fine. How do you know? Because if he wasn't, we'd be hearing a lot more noise. Another sound drifted through the trees. This time unmistakably, a voice raised in pain or fear, abruptly cut short. Then silence rushed back in like water filling a void, and the forest held perfectly still. Ren's breathing quickened. Her fingers dug into Leon's sleeve. They're hurting someone. Yes, the men who hurt my mom. Yes. Ren was quiet for a long moment. Leon expected tears. He expected fear. He expected maybe the moral confusion of a child trying to reconcile the concept of justice with the reality of violence. Instead, Ren's voice came out cold and flat, carrying a weight that made her sound 20 years older than 8. Good. Leon glanced down at her, genuinely surprised by the steel compressed into that single syllable. Ren stared into the fog where Dominic and his men had disappeared. Her jaw set, her eyes hard. The little girl who'd sobbed at his feet 20 minutes ago was still in there somewhere, but something else was emerging alongside her. Something sharper. They hung my mom from a tree like she was trash. Ren continued, her voice shaking now, but not with fear. With rage. They tied me up and made me watch. They laughed. One of them said, she stopped, swallowed hard. Her throat worked around the words like they were made of broken glass. He said nobody would care, that people like us don't matter. Leon's hand tightened on his weapon, not from threat, from anger. The cold, controlled, carefully contained anger of a man who had two daughters at home and could imagine with sickening clarity what it would mean for one of them to hear those words. What else did they say? Ren shook her head. I don't remember all of it. There were four of them. They wore masks, but I could see their eyes. One of them had a tattoo on his hand, a snake eating its own tail. Another one smelled like cigarettes and something sweet, like cologne but bad, like he put on too much to cover something up. Leon filed away these details automatically. Dominic would want them later. The snake tattoo, the cheap cologne, the mask that covered faces but not identities, because identity was more than a face. It was a voice, a smell, a tattoo, a laugh that a child would remember for the rest of her life. They said they'd come back tomorrow to check on things, Ren whispered. They said it like it was funny, like my mom hanging there was a joke to them. They won't be coming back, Leon said. And there was finality in his voice that even a child could recognize as absolute truth. Because of Mr. Thorne. Because of Mr. Thorne. Ren looked at her mother's still form. The shallow rise and fall of Grace's chest beneath the thermal blanket. The angry rope burns circling her wrists, the way Grace's fingers occasionally twitched the nervous system firing signals that the conscious mind couldn't yet process. Then Ren looked up at Leon with eyes that had aged a decade in a single morning. I'm glad I ran to him, she said quietly. I'm glad I didn't run away. So is your mother, Leon replied, even if she doesn't know it yet. In the distance, the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, no voices. Just the heavy, expectant quiet of a place where something irreversible had just occurred. Leon checked his watch. 15 minutes since Dominic had left. The medical team would arrive in 5. Grace would survive. Ren would survive. And somewhere in the bog, men who had laughed while a child watched her mother suffer were learning the cost of cruelty. The lesson was expensive, and the payment was final. The sound of an engine cut through the forest silence. Low, powerful, deliberate. Leon's head snapped up his weapon already halfway out of its holster before he recognized the distinct purr of Dominic's red vehicle navigating the narrow trail that led to the clearing. Stay behind me, he instructed Ren, positioning himself between the child and the approaching sound. Protocol demanded caution regardless of probability. But it was Dominic who emerged from the fog, first walking ahead of the car, that rolled slowly behind him like a shadow on wheels. His black suit was pristine except for a few leaves clinging to his shoulders and a barely visible darkening along the knuckles of his right hand. His face was composed still, the mask he wore more naturally than the suits. Leon, who had worked with him for 7 years, noticed the tension in his jaw. The way his shoulders sat a fraction of an inch higher than normal. The way his eyes swept the clearing with an intensity that suggested he was still operating in combat mode, still calculating, threats still ready. Behind him, Garrett drove while Brennan sat in the passenger seat, both men's faces carved from the same stone that mountains are made of. Whatever had happened in those woods had been handled with the efficiency and finality that Dominic demanded from all operations. Dominic's eyes went immediately to Grace's motionless form, then to Ren, then to Leon. The sequence was deliberate, asset, dependent, operative, each assessed in order of vulnerability. Status, Dominic said, stable but critical. Leon reported, pulse strengthening but still irregular. No signs of internal bleeding that I can detect, but she needs proper medical attention. Hypothermia is setting in despite the blanket. Dominic nodded once and crouched beside Ren. The little girl stared at him with wide eyes, searching his face for something. Answers, reassurance, confirmation of what she'd heard echoing through the trees. Your mother is going to a safe place, Dominic said, his voice quiet but clear. Doctors will take care of her. You'll stay with her the entire time. What about those men? Dominic held her gaze. He didn't blink, didn't soften, didn't offer the comfortable lies that most adults wrapped around children like cotton padding. They won't bother anyone again. Something in the simplicity of that statement, the absolute certainty behind it, made Ren's shoulders drop slightly. A weight she'd been carrying, the weight of fear that those laughing men would return that weight, shifted and fell away like dead leaves from a branch. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask what happened. The silence in the forest was eloquent enough. Thank you, she breathed. Dominic stood without acknowledging the gratitude already moving to help Leon lift Grace. They worked in synchronized silence, Dominic supporting her shoulders, while Leon took her legs, transferring her carefully into the back seat of the vehicle. Garrett had already spread additional blankets across the leather seats, preparing a makeshift stretcher. Ren, get in. The girl scrambled inside, immediately positioning herself beside her mother, one small hand clutching Grace's cold fingers with the fierce determination of someone who would never let go again. Dominic slid in after her, his large frame filling the remaining space. Leon moved to the front passenger seat. Garrett maintained his position behind the wheel. Go, Dominic said simply. The vehicle reversed with surprising agility down the narrow trail, Garrett's hands steady on the wheel despite the treacherous terrain. Branches scraped against windows like fingernails on glass. The fog pressed close, making it nearly impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead. But Garrett had driven worse roads under worse conditions, with worse things in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Dominic monitored Grace's breathing, his fingers resting lightly on her wrist to track her pulse. Weak but present, consistent but slow. The human body was remarkably resilient when given a chance. He'd seen men survive things that should have killed them 3 times over simply because their hearts refused to stop beating. Grace Holloway's heart was still beating. That was enough to work with. Ren watched him with the unblinking intensity of a child who was memorizing everything. Are you a doctor? She asked. No, but you know what to do. I've seen enough injuries to know when someone will survive them. And my mom will survive. Dominic's dark eyes met hers. There was no warmth in them, no gentleness. But there was certainty, the kind that can't be manufactured or performed. Yes. The vehicle broke free from the forest trail and onto the main road. Acceleration was smooth and immediate, the engine responding to Garrett's foot with the eagerness of thoroughbred machinery. The fog thinned as they left the woods behind morning light, struggling through gray clouds overhead, like hope trying to force its way through doubt. "Ite?" Dominic asked. 12 minutes, Garrett replied, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator. Leon pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Medical team confirms they're in position. Surgical suite prepped if needed. Blood supply ready. Good. The vehicle ate up the mild suspension, smoothing out imperfections in the road. Inside, Grace's breathing began to deepen slightly, her body's survival mechanism slowly re-engaging now that she was warm, horizontal, and moving away from the place where she'd almost died. She moved, Ren said suddenly, her voice sharp with hope. Her fingers. I felt them move. Leon turned in his seat. Reflex. Her nervous system is coming back online. That's good, but she's not waking up. Not yet. Maybe not for hours. Her mind needs time to process what happened. Sometimes the body heals faster than the brain allows. Ren absorbed this, her thumb stroking her mother's hand in small repetitive circles, the unconscious rhythm of comfort. Will she remember what they did? Probably, Leon said honestly, but memories lose their teeth over time, especially when you survive them. I'll remember too, Ren said quietly. Forever, Dominic glanced at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been recognition. He'd heard those words before. He'd said them himself once a lifetime ago, standing over a grave too small for the person it contained. Yes, he said, you will. Is that bad? That depends on what you do with the memory. What should I do with it? Survive, grow stronger. Make sure no one ever has that kind of power over you again. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't the gentle reassurance a child deserved from a safe adult in a safe world. It was the cold pragmatism of someone who understood that trauma could either destroy or forge, and the choice, however unfair it was to place on someone so young, ultimately belonged to the survivor. Ren nodded and Leon watched her face in the rearview mirror. The fear was still there, swimming behind her eyes, like something trapped under ice. But something else was there too now. Something harder. Something that looked, if he was being honest, a little bit like the expression Dominic wore every single day of his life. Leon didn't know whether that was a good thing or a heartbreaking one. Probably both. We're here, Garrett announced, turning onto a tree-lined private drive that led to a sprawling estate hidden behind high walls and iron gates that opened automatically as they approached. The property looked like old money from the outside, all manicured hedges and tasteful architecture. The security cameras hidden in the stonework told a different story. A medical team waited at the entrance. 3 people in surgical scrubs, a gurney-ready equipment bags in hand. They moved with the calm efficiency of professionals, who had learned long ago not to ask questions about the patients who arrived at this particular address. The vehicle stopped smoothly, doors opened in coordinated sequence, and Grace Holloway, still unconscious but breathing steadily, was transferred into hands that knew exactly how to pull someone back from the edge she'd been teetering on. Wren started to follow the gurney, but Dominic's hand on her shoulder stopped her. Let them work first. 5 minutes. Then you can stay with her as long as you want. Wren nodded, watching her mother disappear through pristine double doors. She was still alive. They both were. And for the first time since she had woken up tied to a tree, watching masked men pull a rope tight around her mother's wrists and hoist her off the ground, Wren Holloway allowed herself to believe that surviving might actually mean something. It would be 4 hours before Grace Holloway opened her eyes. 4 hours during which doctors cleaned and dressed her wounds, administered fluids, monitored her vitals, and quietly marveled at the fact that she was alive at all. 4 hours during which Wren sat in an oversized leather chair beside the bed, Leon's suit jacket draped over her small frame, her eyes fixed on her mother's face with the vigilance of a soldier standing guard. 4 hours during which Dominic Thorne made phone calls, reviewed security protocols, and began the process of understanding exactly who had ordered Grace Holloway hung from a tree and why. He had answers to the first question within 2 hours. The snake tattoo Wren described was a known marker for men who worked for Vincent Daly, a mid-level operator who ran protection, rackets, and illegal gambling through a club called Paradise on the east side of the city. Small time but vicious. The kind of man who compensated for limited power with unlimited brutality. The why would take longer, but Dominic was patient. Patience was a weapon most people underestimated, and he had built an empire on the things other people overlooked. Grace's eyes opened at 3:17 in the afternoon. No flutter, no gradual emergence. One moment she was unconscious, and the next her eyes were open wide and alert, and filled with the wild, disoriented panic of someone surfacing from deep water. Her first word was not help. It was not where. It was not a name or a plea or a cry. Her first word was Wren. The name tore from her throat before her brain had fully reconnected with her body. Before she understood where she was, or what had happened, or how much time had passed. Before anything else registered, the wrists wrapped in white bandages, the IV feeding into her arm, the unfamiliar ceiling above her, her daughter's name erupted from the deepest part of her, like something that had been fighting to get out for hours. I'm here, Mom. I'm right here. Wren scrambled from the chair and grabbed her mother's hand, and Grace's fingers closed around her daughter's with a grip that would leave bruises. She didn't care. She needed to feel Wren's pulse against her palm, needed the physical proof that her child was alive and present and real. Grace pulled Wren close, wrapping one bandaged arm around her daughter's small body, ignoring the pain that screamed through her wrists at the motion. Wren pressed her face against her mother's chest, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. They just breathed. Together, synchronized. The way they'd breathed during thunderstorms when Wren was 3 and believed her mother could stop lightning. Then Grace's eyes began to move, scanning the room, processing. A medical setup, professional grade, in what appeared to be a converted bedroom in a house far more expensive than any she'd ever entered through the front door. Marble floors, heavy curtains, a window overlooking grounds that stretched farther than anything an honest income could buy. Where are we? Grace said. Her voice was steady, controlled. The panic was still there, but she'd shoved it down beneath the surface where it couldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. A safe place, Wren said. Mr. Thorne brought us here. He saved you, Mom. He cut you down from the tree and brought doctors and... Who is Mr. Thorne? The question was sharp, direct. Not the question of a victim grateful to be rescued, but the question of a woman who understood that rescue always had a price and wanted to know the case before the bill arrived. Leon stepped into the doorway. He'd been standing just outside monitoring, waiting for this exact moment. Mrs. Holloway, I'm Leon. I work for Dominic Thorne. You're in his safe house and you're under his protection. Your daughter found us on the road this morning and asked for help. We provided it. Grace studied him, took in the suit, the build, the way his hand rested near his hip with the casual familiarity of a man who carried a weapon the way other people carried wallets. She'd worked in Daly's club long enough to recognize the type. What does your boss want? She asked. Right now, nothing. He wants you to heal. Nobody does nothing for free, especially not men like your boss. Leon almost smiled. She was right, of course. In the world he inhabited, generosity was either strategy or weakness, and Dominic Thorne was never weak. He'll want to speak with you when you're ready. That's all I can tell you. Grace nodded slowly, her arm tightening around Wren. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, breathing in the smell of mud and sweat, and the faint ghost of the strawberry shampoo she'd used last night 100 years ago in the apartment where they had been safe. Then she did something that surprised Leon. She sat up. Not slowly, not tentatively. She pushed herself upright, swinging her legs off the bed, her wrapped wrists braced against the mattress. Her face went white from the pain, and Wren made a sound of protest, but Grace's expression was set, determined, the look of a woman who had decided that lying down was finished. I want to see him now, Grace said. Whoever this Dominic Thorne is, I want to look him in the eye and understand what's happening. I don't wait for people to decide my fate. Not anymore. Leon studied her for a moment. Then he stepped back and pulled out his phone. Dominic Thorne entered the room 4 minutes later. He closed the door behind him, but left it unlocked. Never trap yourself in a room without exit options, a lesson learned early and never forgotten. Grace watched him approach. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink back against the pillows. She sat upright on the edge of the bed, Wren tucked against her side, and she met his eyes with an intensity that suggested she was trying to read every secret he'd ever buried. Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Holloway, just Grace. She paused. My daughter told me what happened, what you did. I need to understand why. Dominic moved to stand near the window, maintaining distance. Close enough to speak normally, far enough to give her space. It was a gesture he'd learned from years of conversations with people who had been through violence. Proximity was threatening. Distance was respect. Your daughter was brave enough to ask for retainer help, he said. I was in a position to provide it. That's the entirety of the explanation. Grace made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't hurt. You don't strike me as a man who does things without calculation. Dominic didn't deny it. The men who hurt you, he continued, his tone shifting to the flat business-like register he used when emotion was irrelevant. They work for a man named Vincent Daley. He sent them to make an example of you over a debt. $3,000 allegedly stolen from his club's register. And that was when Grace Holloway said the thing that changed everything. She looked Dominic Thorne directly in the eyes, this dangerous man in his expensive suit, standing in his expensive room, with his expensive security detail, and she said the thing that most victims in her position would never say. She told the truth. It wasn't 3,000, Grace said. Her voice was steady, clear, unflinching. It was 400. I took $400 from the register at the Paradise Club 8 weeks ago, one time, because my daughter needed emergency ear surgery and my insurance wouldn't cover it, and I didn't have $400 and I didn't have time to find it. Silence filled the room. Even Wren looked up at her mother with surprise. I was going to pay it back, Grace continued. I'd already started. Picked up extra shifts, sold my car. I had 200 saved. 2 more weeks and the register would have been whole. But someone told Daley I took it, and Daley said the number was 3,000. And when I tried to show him the math, he said examples needed to be made. That debts were debts, regardless of amount. That the principle mattered more than the money. She paused, her jaw tightening. He was right about one thing. I did steal. $400 to save my daughter's hearing. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm innocent, because I'm not. But I'm not guilty of what they said I did. And whatever I am guilty of doesn't justify hanging me from a tree while my 8-year-old daughter watches. Dominic studied her. He'd expected a victim. He'd expected tears, denial, gratitude, the standard repertoire of someone who'd been saved and wanted to keep being saved. What he got instead was a woman who owned her mistakes while refusing to accept disproportionate punishment for them. A woman who drew a line between what she'd done and what had been done to her with the precision of someone who understood moral accounting. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months. Who knew about the 400, Dominic asked. One person. Grace's voice changed. Something cracked beneath the steadiness, a fracture running through bedrock. One person in the world. My friend. My best friend. Jolene Marsh. We worked at the diner together, before the club. She was there when Wren got sick. She drove us to the emergency room. She held my hand in the waiting room. She's the one I told when I took the money because I trusted her more than anyone on earth. She stopped. Her eyes went distant, traveling backward through memory to a moment of realization that hurt worse than the rope burns on her wrists. Daly said someone on the inside confirmed the amount was 3,000. Someone who worked at the club. Jolene got a job at Paradise 2 months before I did. She recommended me for the position. Grace's hands began to shake, not from fear, not from cold, from the specific kind of tremor that comes when the body processes a betrayal so complete that it rewrites every good memory associated with the person who committed it. Jolene is the only person who knew I took that money, and she's the only person who could have told Daly it was more than it was. Ren stared at her mother. Mom, Jolene, she comes to our house. She brought me a birthday present last. Grace pulled her daughter closer, pressing her lips against Ren's hair. I know, baby. I know. Dominic watched this unfold without moving, but behind his dark eyes, calculations were running. A debt of 400 inflated to 3,000. A friend who provided the false information. A punishment wildly disproportionate to the actual offense. These weren't the actions of a man collecting money. These were the actions of a man eliminating a problem and using the debt as cover. The question was what problem Grace Holloway actually represented, and whether Jolene Marsh had been a willing participant or a weapon aimed by someone else. Dominic moved toward the door. Rest, he said. Heal. When you're ready, we'll talk more. I have questions about Daly's operation. Grace's voice stopped him before he reached the handle. Mr. Thorne, he turned. I'm not going to lie here and wait for someone else to fix my life. Whatever you're planning, whatever comes next, I'm part of it. Not because I owe you and not because I'm brave, because those men made my daughter watch them hang me from a tree. And the woman I trusted most in the world handed them the rope. Her eyes were dry, clear, burning with something that Dominic recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. Rage. Controlled, compressed, patient rage. The kind that didn't explode. The kind that waited until it could be aimed. I understand, Dominic said. He left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. In the hallway, Leon waited with his arms crossed. She's not what I expected, Leon said. No, Dominic replied. She's not. What now? Now we find out why Vincent Daly wanted a waitress dead over $400. And we find out what Jolene Marsh gained by betraying her. And Grace. Dominic glanced back at the closed door behind which a woman who'd been hanging from a tree 6 hours ago was already planning her next move instead of mourning her last one. Grace Holloway is going to be a problem, he said. The good kind. Leon raised an eyebrow. Those are the most dangerous, he said quietly. Dominic didn't disagree. The safe house settled into evening around them, shadows lengthening across marble floors, security lights activating one by one along the perimeter wall. Somewhere inside, a little girl with bloody feet finally fell asleep holding her mother's hand. And her mother lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling planning. Not escape, not gratitude, not submission. Grace Holloway was planning war. She just needed to figure out which battles were hers to fight. 3 days passed in the safe house like time suspended in amber. Not moving forward, not moving backward. Just held preserved, waiting for whatever would shatter the stillness. Grace Holloway healed faster than the doctors expected. The color returned to her face within 36 hours. The trembling in her hands subsided by the second evening. She walked the hallways by the end of the first day, slow and careful. Her bandaged wrists held close to her body like wounded wings, but upright, moving, refusing the wheelchair they offered with a look that made the suggestion feel foolish. Ren stayed close, always within arm's reach. She slept curled beside her mother in the oversized medical bed, waking from nightmares that came in waves, gasping, reaching out in the darkness until her fingers found Grace's hand. Then she'd breathe again. Remember she was safe. Remember the fog was gone and the tree was far away, and the man with the cold eyes had promised that the laughing men would never return. She'd curl back into sleep, her small hand locked around her mother's wrist, careful to avoid the bandages, holding on with the grip of someone who understood that the people you love can be taken from you between one heartbeat and the next. Dominic visited twice daily, morning and evening, brief check-ins that lasted no more than 5 minutes. He'd ask about Grace's recovery, ensure Ren had everything she needed, then disappear back into whatever corridors of power and violence consumed his days. He never stayed long enough for comfort to develop. Never allowed familiarity to soften the necessary distance between savior and saved. Grace used those 3 days. While the doctors monitored her wounds and encouraged rest, her mind worked. She lay in that expensive bed, staring at the ceiling of a room that cost more than everything she'd earned in a decade, and she took apart the last year of her life, piece by piece, every shift at the Paradise Club, every conversation with Jolene, every interaction with Vincent Daly's network. She assembled a map of her own destruction and studied it until she could see the seams. On the third evening, she asked to speak with Dominic alone. Leon led Ren to the kitchen for dinner. The little girl went reluctantly, casting a look back at her mother that carried more understanding than any 8-year-old should possess. She knew something was about to change. Children who had survived what Ren survived developed a seismic sensitivity to shifts in the emotional landscape. They felt the tremors before the earthquake. Grace sat upright when Dominic entered. No pillows propping her up, no blankets pulled to her chin. She sat on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, her wrapped wrists resting on her knees. Ready, coiled. A woman who had spent 3 days preparing for this exact conversation. "I need to tell you something," Grace said without preamble. Something I should have said the first day, but I needed to think it through. Make sure I wasn't wrong. Dominic moved to his usual position near the window, arms at his sides, face neutral, listening the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, filing every word into the architecture of his understanding. "You told me Daly sent those men because of the money," Grace continued. $3,000, a debt, an example to be made. But that's not the real reason. The money was just the excuse. She paused, and Dominic saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The look of someone holding a piece of information that changed the shape of everything around it. "When I worked at the Paradise Club, I wasn't just waiting tables. I mean, that was my job. Cocktails, food, cleaning up after the card games in the back. But Daly's operation wasn't careful. They didn't think the wait staff noticed anything, or they didn't care because we were just waitresses. Nobody. Invisible." Grace's voice hardened on that last word. "But I noticed things. I noticed that every Thursday night after the club closed, Daly and a man named Briggs, his accountant, would go into the office behind the bar. They'd stay for hours. I could hear them through the wall when I was cleaning. Numbers, names, amounts that didn't match anything on the legitimate books." She met Dominic's eyes directly. "One night about 3 months ago, I was cleaning the bar area, and the office door was open. Not much, maybe 6 inches, but enough. I could see Daly sitting at the desk with a black leather ledger, old-fashioned, handwritten. He was going through it page by page with Briggs, and I could hear them talking about payments. Not the card games, not the protection money, payments to police, to a judge, to someone they kept calling the alderman. And there were other entries, names I didn't recognize, amounts that were enormous, hundreds of thousands." Dominic's stillness deepened, the kind of stillness that predators achieved in the moment before they moved. "I only saw it for maybe 30 seconds, Grace said. Then Briggs noticed the door and shut it. He looked at me through the glass. I pretended I hadn't seen anything. Went back to wiping the bar. But we both knew. That look he gave me. He knew I'd seen the ledger." She flexed her wrists, wincing slightly. 2 weeks later, Daly accused me of stealing $3,000. 2 weeks. That's not coincidence. That's a timeline. He needed a reason to get rid of me, and the 400 I actually took gave him one. All he had to do was inflate the number, make it sound like a pattern instead of a desperate one-time mistake, and suddenly he had justification for whatever he wanted to do. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the last light of evening painted the manicured grounds in shades of gold and amber. "They didn't hang me from that tree because of money," Grace said. "They hung me from that tree because of what's in that ledger. And as long as that ledger exists, Ren and I will never be safe. Not from Daly, not from whoever those names belong to, not from any of it." Dominic was silent for a long time, processing, recalculating. The equation he'd built around Grace Holloway, innocent victim, disproportionate, punishment, straightforward rescue, was dissolving and reforming into something far more complex. A black ledger containing records of payments to law enforcement and public officials. A waitress who'd glimpsed it. An accusation fabricated to create pretext for elimination. This wasn't a collection operation gone brutal. This was a cover-up. And cover-ups by their nature never stopped at the first body. "Where is the ledger kept?" Dominic asked. "In a floor safe behind the bar at Paradise Club, below the cash register. You have to move a section of floorboard to access it. Daly thinks no one knows about it except him and Briggs. But I watched him open it twice through the office window reflection. I know the combination." Dominic studied her. This woman who had been hanging from a tree 72 hours ago was sitting in front of him offering operational intelligence that most of his informants couldn't have produced in a month of surveillance. She wasn't begging for safety. She was providing the weapon needed to achieve it. "You understand what you're telling me," Dominic said. "I'm telling you that Daly has a book full of secrets that powerful people would kill to keep hidden, and that I'm the loose end he tried to cut." Grace's jaw tightened. "I'm also telling you that I know his club. I know his schedule. I know which floorboard hides the safe. And I know the combination." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. "That's not your fight," Dominic said. Grace looked at him with eyes that burned. "They made it my fight when they tied my daughter to a chair and made her watch them hang me. They made it my fight when they laughed about it. They made it my fight when the woman I trusted most in the world sold me out. You can tell me to rest. You can tell me to heal. But you cannot tell me this isn't my fight. Because everything that's happened to me in the last 3 months started in that club with that ledger, and it ends there too." Dominic said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned toward the door. "Tomorrow," he said. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we start." It wasn't agreement. It wasn't permission. It was acknowledgement that Grace Holloway had stopped being a person he was protecting and had become a person he was working with. The distinction mattered more than most people understood. Grace watched him leave, and for the first time since the oak tree, something loosened in her chest. Not relief, not peace. Something harder and more useful than either: purpose. The cabin sat 3 miles northeast of the clearing where Grace had been found. Hidden behind a wall of pine trees and accessible only by a dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in years, it was the kind of place that existed specifically for things that needed to happen far from witnesses. Smoke curled from a rusted metal chimney. Golden light spilled through gaps in shuttered windows. Inside, voices rose and fell in heated argument, occasionally punctuated by the crack of beer bottles being opened or furniture being kicked by men whose nerves had been shredded by 3 days of waiting and wondering. Dominic observed all of this from the tree line, crouched in absolute stillness, 50 yards from the structure. Beside him, Garrett scanned the perimeter through night vision binoculars while Brennan circled around to cover the back exit. Leon remained at the safe house with strict instructions: protect Grace and Wren at all costs. And Grace was there too, not inside the perimeter, not in the line of fire. She stood 20 yards behind Dominic, pressed against a massive pine tree, wearing borrowed dark clothing that was too large for her frame. Dominic had argued against her presence for 30 minutes before recognizing the immovable quality of her decision. She wasn't asking to come. She was coming. The only question was whether it happened with his knowledge and control or without it. He'd chosen control. 4 targets confirmed. Garrett whispered, his breath barely visible in the cold evening air. All armed, 2 rifles visible through the window. They're agitated. Lot of movement, lot of shouting. Dominic watched the cabin with predatory patience. The structure was old but solid. Thick logs, minimal windows, 1 primary entrance, 1 rear exit. Defensible if you knew trouble was coming. A coffin if you didn't. "They're scared," Dominic observed quietly. Good reason to be. They went back to the clearing and found the rope cut and the woman gone. No trail to follow, no explanation. "That kind of mystery eats at men like these. We could burn them out," Garrett suggested. "Old cabin like this would go in minutes. Too loud, too visible." Dominic's eyes never left the structure. "We walk in, we control the situation, and Grace gets her answers." Garrett glanced back toward where Grace waited in the darkness. She was motionless, silent, her wrapped wrist the only visible detail pale against the dark clothing. Brennan's voice crackled through the earpiece. "In position, back door secured, no activity on this side." Dominic touched his own earpiece. "Hold until my signal. Nobody leaves." "Copy." "On 3, Dominic said to Garrett. They moved through the trees like smoke given direction. Dominic's approach was direct. No stealth at the final moment. No subtlety. He walked the last 10 feet to the front door, like a man entering his own home, and kicked it open with enough force to tear the old hinges from the frame. The door exploded inward. 4 men inside jumped to their feet, hands reaching for weapons that wouldn't save them. Dominic stepped through the threshold, his weapon raised and steady. Garrett followed one step behind, covering the right side of the room. The cabin's interior was exactly what the exterior promised. Rough-hewn walls, a battered wooden table covered in beer bottles, cigarette butts, and what looked like a hand-drawn map. A fireplace crackling with the remains of logs that had been burning all day. And 4 men who looked like they'd been expecting trouble, but not this kind. Don't. Dominic's voice was quiet. The word carried more weight than a shout, more authority than a threat, more finality than a gunshot. All 4 men froze. The largest man stood near the table. He was maybe 40 with a thick beard and the heavy build of someone who'd spent more time hitting things than thinking about them. On his left hand, clearly visible, even in the dim light, was a tattoo of a snake eating its own tail. Hank. Wren's description had been precise. Beside the fireplace stood a man with a red bandana around his neck. Red, the one who smelled like cheap cologne and cigarettes. Even from across the room, Dominic caught the sickly sweet scent that Wren had described. At the table sat a younger man with a poorly healed scar across his cheek. Kyle, maybe 25. Old enough to know better. Young enough to think he was invincible. The fear in his eyes suggested that particular illusion was dying fast. Against the far wall leaned an older man with gray threading through his beard. Gus, the quiet one. The one who'd been around long enough to recognize the mathematics of a situation and understand that some solutions were final. "Who the hell are you?" Hank demanded. His voice carried less conviction than his posture suggested. "The man who cut Grace Holloway down from your tree," Dominic replied evenly. The 4 men exchanged glances, and in that exchange, Dominic read everything he needed. Fear, confusion, the beginning of a terrible understanding. "That wasn't your business," Hank said, his hand inching toward a pistol on his hip. Garrett's weapon shifted, a fractional movement, the barrel pointing directly at Hank's center mass. Hank's hand stopped. "You hung a woman from a tree," Dominic continued. "You left her 8-year-old daughter tied to a chair and forced her to watch. You laughed while you did it. One of you told that child that nobody would care about people like her." He let the words settle. "Let them find their targets. You made it everyone's business." "She owed a debt," Hank shot back. "To who?" "Daly, Vincent Daly. She worked at his club. Skimmed from the register. $3,000. 400, Dominic corrected. She took $400 to pay for her daughter's surgery. One time. And she was paying it back. Someone inflated the number to justify what was done to her. Someone who wanted her dead for reasons that had nothing to do with money." Hank's expression shifted. Not much, but enough for Dominic to read the confusion there. Hank didn't know about the real number. He'd been told 3,000. He'd been told a story that made hanging a woman from a tree sound like business. "I asked a question," Dominic said. "Who gave the order?" But before Hank could speak, Kyle broke. "7 of us," the young man blurted, his voice cracking. "There were 7 total. 3 aren't here. They went into the woods after." He stopped, swallowed. The implication of what had happened to the other 3 hung in the air. Hank shot Kyle a glare that could have stripped paint, but the damage was done. "Names," Dominic said. Kyle looked at his companion, saw no support, and made the calculation that cooperation might extend his life. "Me. That's Hank," read, by the fireplace, Gus against the wall. "The 3 who didn't come back are Vic, Danny, and Mitch. They received exactly what they earned," Dominic said. "The same mercy they showed Grace Holloway," which was none. The sound of a branch snapping outside made all 4 men tense, but Dominic remained perfectly still. He knew what it was, who it was. Grace Holloway stepped through the ruined doorway. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a verdict. The borrowed dark clothing hung loose on her frame, and her wrapped wrists caught the firelight, but she stood straight, steady. Her eyes swept the room and found each man in sequence. Red, who smelled like cologne and cruelty. Gus, who'd watched without objecting. Kyle, who was young enough to be afraid. And Hank, who had the snake tattoo that her daughter would see in nightmares for years. Hank's face went pale. "You're supposed to be dead," he breathed. I'm the waitress you left hanging from a tree, Grace said. Her voice was level, calm, carrying the kind of cold that comes from the center of a fire, not the edge. And I'm still standing. Hank stared at her. The room was utterly silent. Dominic watched Grace and saw something he rarely witnessed. A person standing in front of their own nightmare and refusing to blink. Tell me something, Grace continued, taking a step closer to Hank. When you strung me up, when you pulled that rope tight enough to cut through my skin, did Daly tell you why? The real reason. Not the money, the real one. Hank's confusion deepened. We were told you stole 3,000. I took 400 to save my daughter's hearing. And I was paying it back. Someone turned that into something else. Someone needed me gone and the money was just the story they wrapped around it. She looked at each man in turn. None of you asked why the punishment was so extreme for $3,000. None of you questioned why Daly wanted a spectacle, why the child had to watch, why he needed an example made of a waitress who owed pocket change by his standards. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Because you don't ask questions, Grace said. You just follow orders and tell yourselves that following orders makes it someone else's responsibility. But it doesn't. You tied the ropes, you pulled them tight, you laughed while my daughter screamed. Kyle's eyes were wet. He looked away from her. Dominic stepped forward. The question remains, who else was involved in the order? Not just the muscle, the decision makers, the people Daly reports to. Hank spat on the floor. You think Daly reports to anybody? He runs his own show. Nobody runs their own show, Dominic said. Everybody answers to someone. Daly has protection. I want to know who provides it. I don't know. Garrett's weapon moved again. That same fractional adjustment that made the air change pressure. There's a man, Gus said quietly from against the wall. Every eye in the room turned to him. It was the first time the older man had spoken. His voice was like gravel dragged across stone. Low, rough, tired. Hank's face twisted with rage. Shut your mouth. We're dead anyway, Gus replied. His tone flat. I'd rather it be quick than whatever happens when Daly finds out we lost her. He looked at Dominic with the hollow pragmatism of a man who had run out of options and settled for honesty as a final currency. There's a man who comes to the club once a month, late, after closing, drives a town car with government plates. Daly meets with him in the office. Alone. We're not allowed in the building when it happens, but I've seen him arrive. Tall, gray hair, expensive coat, carries himself like someone who's never had to carry anything else. And you don't know his name, Dominic pressed. Daly calls him the alderman. That's all I ever heard. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. The alderman. The same title Grace had heard through the office wall. The same name recorded in the black leather ledger that had sealed her fate. Dominic glanced at Grace. She met his eyes and nodded slightly. Confirmation. The pieces were fitting together. Dominic turned back to the four men. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you a choice, which is more than you gave Grace Holloway. The four men waited. You tell me everything about Daly's operation, every location, every associate, every payment, every weakness. You give me everything and you walk out of here. Hank's eyes narrowed. Walk out to what? To wherever you go when you start over. New city, new name, new life. But you never come back. You never contact Daly. And if I ever find out you've touched another woman or child, I'll revisit this conversation under different terms. And if we don't talk, Kyle asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. Dominic's silence answered for him. They talked. It took 40 minutes. Details poured out in fragments that Dominic assembled in real time. The Paradise Club's layout, Daly's weekly schedule, the card games that served as fronts for money laundering, the warehouses in the industrial district, the names of police officers on payroll, the protection racket that squeezed small businesses along the east side. Grace listened to every word, stored every detail. When the men's accounts conflicted with what she'd observed during her own time at the club, she corrected them. Quietly, precisely, adding layers to the intelligence that Dominic's men alone could never have provided. By the time they were finished, the cabin felt emptied of something more than just information. The four men sat diminished, smaller than when the evening had begun. Dominic stood. Go. Now. Don't stop moving until you're somewhere I can't find you. And pray that you never give me a reason to look." The four men filed out of the cabin in silence. No parting threats, no defiant glares. Just the shuffling footsteps of men who understood that they'd been granted something they didn't deserve and that the gift wouldn't be repeated. Grace watched them disappear into the darkness. "You let them go," she said. Dominic holstered his weapon. "I gave them information they can verify. That builds cooperation. Dead men can't tell other men what happens when you cross my path. Living men who are afraid tell everyone." Grace considered this, the pragmatism of mercy, the strategic value of fear distributed through survivors rather than concentrated in corpses. "The ledger," she said, "that's the real target." "Yes, and the alderman, whoever he is." "One thing at a time," Dominic replied. "First we get the ledger. Everything else follows from that." They moved back toward the vehicles, Garrett and Brennan falling into formation around them. The forest was silent, profoundly, completely, as if every living thing within its borders had decided that quiet was the safest option. Grace walked beside Dominic, not behind him. She didn't reach for his arm, didn't lean on him, didn't show any sign of the woman who'd been hanging from a tree 4 days ago, except for the thin white dressings on her wrists visible at the edge of her sleeves. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me be there." Dominic didn't look at her. "You didn't need my permission." "No, but I needed to see their faces. I needed them to see mine, and now I need to get that ledger." The drive back to the safe house took 23 minutes. Garrett drove with the headlights off for the first mile, navigating by moonlight and memory before switching them on once they reached the paved road. The darkness outside the windows was complete. Rural darkness. Grace sat in the back seat, her eyes focused on the passing trees. Her mind was already in the Paradise Club, already behind the bar, already kneeling beside the floorboard that hid the safe. They were a quarter-mile from the safe house when Dominic's phone buzzed. He answered immediately. Leon's voice was different, clipped, hard. The tone a soldier uses when the situation has moved past concern and into action. "We've got a problem, boss. 4 men, arrived 8 minutes ago, tried the west perimeter first, then circled to the service entrance. I've neutralized 2. The other 2 pulled back into the tree cover on the north side. They're regrouping." Grace went rigid in her seat. Ren is secure," Leon replied. He'd heard her through the phone. "I moved her to the interior room with Dr. Caldwell before they breached. Reinforced door, 2 inches of steel. She's scared, but she's safe." "How did they find us?" Dominic asked. His voice carried no alarm, just the flat operational tone of a man who processed threats the way other people processed weather reports. "Trail cams," Leon said. "Garrett found one on the drive back from the clearing yesterday, but there must have been others. They captured your vehicle. Someone ran the plates or recognized the route. Either way, they knew we were using this location." Dominic looked at Garrett, who was already accelerating. "Status of the 2 remaining," Dominic asked. "Armed, professional, better equipped than the cabin crew. These aren't street-level enforcers, boss. They're contractors. Someone spent real money on this team." Daily Grace whispered. "Leon, we're 4 minutes out. Hold position. Don't engage unless they advance on the building." "Copy." "But boss," Leon paused. "One of the men I took down had a phone on him. Last outgoing call was to an encrypted number. Whoever sent them knows the operation failed. They'll send more." "How long? Hours? Maybe less." The vehicle surged forward. Grace gripped the door handle, the pressure sending pain through her healing wrists. But the pain was distant, irrelevant. Background noise compared to the single thought that consumed her entire consciousness. Her daughter was in a steel room in a building under attack because of choices that traced back to a moment Grace had looked through a door she should have ignored. "This is because of me," Grace said. Her voice was controlled, but beneath the control was something seismic. "This is because of Vincent Daly," Dominic corrected. "Your only crime was surviving." The safe house appeared through the darkness, security lights blazing white against the surrounding trees. Garrett killed the headlights and pulled around to the east side, stopping behind a stone wall that provided cover. Dominic was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, weapon drawn, moving with the practiced fluidity of someone who'd lived more of his life in situations like this than out of them. Grace followed. "Stay in the vehicle," Dominic said without turning. "My daughter is in that building," Grace replied. Dominic stopped, turned. In the harsh white light, His face was all angles and shadows, the tattoos on his neck standing out like war paint. "Then stay behind me," he said. "And if I tell you to run, you run." Grace nodded. They moved. Brennan split off toward the north tree line to hunt the two remaining attackers. Garrett took a position at the east entrance. Dominic moved through the front entrance with Grace 2 steps behind, clearing rooms with the systematic efficiency of a combat drill. The house was quiet. The medical staff had retreated to the interior rooms per emergency protocol. The lights in the hallway flickered. One of the security circuits had been tripped, casting the marble floors in a stuttering light that made every shadow jump and shift. They found Leon at the junction of the main hallway and the medical wing. He was standing against the wall, his weapon in his right hand, his left arm pressed tight against his side. Blood had soaked through his shirt from shoulder to elbow, the dark stains spreading against the white fabric. Two down, Leon reported, his voice steady despite the wound. "Service entrance." They came in fast. Military pattern breach. Flash bang through the window, entry through the door. I caught the first one in the hallway. The second made it to the medical wing before I dropped him. Took a round in the process. He indicated a door at the end of the hallway, small hole in the wall where a bullet had punched through drywall. Grace didn't wait to hear more. She moved past Dominic, past Leon, down the hallway to the reinforced door of the interior room. She knocked 3 times, then twice. The pattern Wren would recognize because Grace used it every day when she came home from work and knocked on Wren's bedroom door to say goodnight. The door opened from inside. Dr. Caldwell, the on-site medical officer, stood aside, and behind her, wedged into the corner of the room, between a filing cabinet and the wall, sat Wren. But Wren wasn't cowering. The little girl's face was white, paper white, the color of things that had been drained of everything that made them alive. Her eyes were enormous, the pupils dilated so wide that almost no iris was visible. She was shaking, the full body trembling of a nervous system in overload. But in her right hand, she clutched Dominic's phone. The emergency number Leon had given her programmed into the device before he'd sealed her inside the room. "I called him," Wren said, her voice barely there. "Mr. Leon gave me the phone. He said if anything happened, I should call Mr. Thorne. So I called him. I told him that they were here." Grace's eyes went to Dominic, who stood in the hallway behind her. He gave the slightest nod. The girl had called during the drive. The call that confirmed what Leon's report suggested. The call that had made Garrett push the accelerator to the floor. 8 years old, Dinon, locked in a steel room, hearing gunfire through 2 inches of reinforced metal. And instead of screaming, instead of falling apart, Wren Holloway had picked up a phone and called for reinforcements. Grace crossed the room and dropped to her knees in front of her daughter. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't try to explain or reassure or minimize. She wrapped both arms around Wren and held her. Wren's shaking intensified for a moment, a wave cresting, and then her arms came up and locked around her mother's neck. She pressed her face into Grace's shoulder and made a sound that was older than words. "Deeper, I'm here," Grace whispered. "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." But even as she held her daughter, Grace's eyes were scanning the room, taking inventory, processing. And she'd already made a decision that she would execute the moment Wren was stable enough to release. She stood, guided Wren to Dr. Caldwell, kissed her daughter's forehead, and walked out of the safe room. In the kitchen, she found what she was looking for. A chef's knife, 8 inches, carbon steel, heavy in her hand but balanced. She tested the grip, adjusted her fingers, walked to the hallway that connected the kitchen to the service entrance, the same hallway Leon had defended, and planted herself in front of the door. She stood there with the knife at her side, her wrapped wrists aching from the grip her body positioned between the entrance and the path that led to her daughter. If anyone came through that door who wasn't Dominic or his men, they would have to go through her first. Dominic found her there 3 minutes later, after Brennan's voice came through the earpiece reporting that both remaining attackers had been neutralized in the north tree line. Trying to reach a vehicle. Didn't make it. The threat was over. The safe house was secure. And Grace Holloway stood in a hallway with a kitchen knife blood on the marble floor behind her, her jaw set and her eyes burning with something that went beyond courage into territory that didn't have a name. "I told you," she said when Dominic's eyes moved from her face to the knife and back. "I'm not hiding anymore." Dominic looked at her for a long moment. This woman, this waitress, this mother who had been hanging from a tree 5 days ago and was now standing guard over her child with a blade in her hand and murder in her eyes. Running keeps you alive, Grace said quietly. It doesn't keep you safe. Dominic recognized the words, not because she'd quoted him, because they were the same words he'd carried since he was 14 years old, standing in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood the city had forgotten, looking down at a small body that should have been sleeping, but was instead perfectly irreversibly still. Sophia, his sister, 8 years old when she died. The same age as Ren, beaten by men his family owed money to men who had come to collect a debt measured in dollars and had taken payment in something that could never be repaid. And nobody had stopped it. Nobody had intervened. The neighbors heard the screaming and turned up their televisions. The police arrived 40 minutes after the call, 40 minutes after it mattered, and wrote a report that used words like unfortunate and tragic and under investigation, words that meant nothing and changed nothing and let everyone pretend that a little girl's death was an event rather than a choice. Dominic had stood in that apartment, 14 years old, too young to have power, too weak to have mattered, and he had made a promise to the body that couldn't hear it. If I ever have the means, if I ever have the strength, I will never stand by. I will never let this happen to someone else, not while I can stop it. He had built an empire on that promise. Every brick of it, every dollar, every act of violence and strategy and cold calculation. All of it traced back to that apartment and that small body and the 14-year-old boy who had sworn that helplessness was a condition he would never accept again. And now in a hallway that smelled of gunpowder and expensive marble cleaner, a woman with a kitchen knife was saying the same words that had been carved into his bones for 20 years. Running keeps you alive. It doesn't keep you safe. Dominic took the knife from Grace's hand, gently, not because she was wrong to hold it, but because the threat had passed and weapons without targets were just weight. We move tonight, he said. Secondary location, full protocol. Grace nodded. She went back to Ren, lifted her daughter onto her hip, ignoring the protest from her healing wrists, and carried her through the damaged hallway without looking at the blood or the bullet holes or any of it. Ren pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, and Grace walked through the wreckage with the focused determination of a woman who had decided that the only direction left was forward. The secondary safe house was 30 miles north, smaller, less elegant, chosen for anonymity rather than luxury. Linoleum floors instead of marble, fluorescent lighting instead of chandeliers. But the security was identical. Leon, his left arm in a field sling, maintained his position at the front entrance. Brennan covered the rear. Garrett ran counter-surveillance routes. It was past midnight when Ren finally fell asleep. Grace tucked her into the narrow bed in the small room they had been given, arranged Leon's suit jacket over her daughter's shoulders, and stood in the doorway listening to Ren breathe. Then she found Dominic in the kitchen. He stood by the window looking out at nothing. The darkness beyond the glass was absolute. His face was reflected in it, ghostly and transparent, overlaid on the night like a memory that couldn't decide whether it belonged to the present or the past. You lost someone, Grace said. She said it as a statement, not a question, because she'd seen his face in the hallway when she'd spoken those words about running. She'd watched something move behind his eyes that went deeper than calculation, deeper than strategy, something old and wounded and carefully guarded. Dominic was quiet for a long time. My sister, he said finally. The words came out like something being unlocked after years of sealed storage. Sophia, she was 8 years old. Grace waited. She didn't prompt, didn't push. She stood in the kitchen of a safe house at 1 a.m. and gave this dangerous man the same thing he'd given her: space and silence and the respect of being heard. Men came to collect a debt my father owed, Dominic continued. Small money, the kind of money that should never cost a life. But they wanted to make an example. They wanted the neighborhood to understand what happened when you didn't pay. Sophia was home. I was at school by the time I got there. He stopped. His jaw flexed. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. She was 8 years old, he said again. The same age as your daughter. And nobody stopped it. Nobody cared. The police wrote a report. The neighbors shook their heads. And my sister was buried in a box that was smaller than the kitchen table we ate dinner at every night. Grace felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. Not sympathy. Something more fundamental. Recognition. The understanding that she was standing across from a man who had been shaped by the same forge that was shaping her. Loss, rage, the refusal to accept powerlessness as a permanent condition. I was 14, Dominic said, too young to do anything, too weak to matter. But I made a promise, to her, to myself, that if I ever had power, I'd use it differently. That if I saw someone being hurt, someone defenseless, I'd be the one who stopped it. And you kept that promise. When I can. The kitchen was very quiet. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the small room feel like an interrogation cell. But neither of them noticed. They were somewhere else, in the space between confession and understanding, where two people who had been broken by violence recognized the identical fracture lines in each other. Thank you, Grace said, for telling me. Dominic turned from the window. His face was composed again. The moment of vulnerability had closed, like a door being shut firmly but without slamming. He'd shown her the room behind it. That was enough. We need to discuss the club, he said, returning to operational matters, with the seamless transition of a man who knew that emotion, however real, could not be allowed to interfere with execution. Daly knows someone interfered. After tonight, he knows it's me. The timeline just compressed. Grace understood. The attack on the safe house changed everything. They'd been operating under the assumption that Daly was reacting. Now he was hunting, and hunters with resources and desperation were the most dangerous combination in the world. How soon, Grace asked. Tomorrow night, Thursday. Daly meets with Briggs on Thursdays to review the books. He'll be at the club until at least 2 a.m., but he leaves by 3. The window is between 3 and 6. 4 minutes inside. That's all I need. Dominic studied her in the harsh kitchen light. Her face was thinner than it had been 5 days ago. The shadows under her eyes were deeper. The dressings on her wrists were slightly gray from 5 days of healing and movement. But her eyes were clear, focused, certain. 4 minutes, Dominic repeated. I know the combination. I know the layout. I've walked that floor 1,000 times. I can do this. A long pause. Then Dominic nodded. My men will be positioned outside. If anything goes wrong, you come to me. No hesitation, no heroics. Grace held his gaze. Agreed. The plan was set. The clock was running. And 23 miles south in a private office above the Paradise Club, a man named Vincent Daly was about to make the call that would determine how the next 24 hours unfolded. Daly sat behind a mahogany desk and smiled. The screen of his phone displayed a photograph. Grainy. Taken from a trail camera mounted on a pine tree near the clearing where Grace Holloway was supposed to have died. The image showed a black vehicle. Expensive. The license plate was partially visible, but the man standing beside it was unmistakable to anyone who knew the architecture of power on this side of the state. Dominic Thorne Daly said the name to himself, tasting it like wine he was evaluating. Well. He was 53, slim-dressed in a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. His office was immaculate. Leather-bound books lined one wall. A crystal decanter of scotch sat on a silver tray. The room smelled of sandalwood and ambition. Nothing about Vincent Daly suggested the kind of cruelty he ordered the way other men ordered lunch. That was the point. Daly picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. It rang twice. We have a development, Daly said. His voice was pleasant, conversational. The Holloway woman is alive, and she's with Dominic Thorne. Silence on the other end. Then a voice older, careful, carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to choosing words the way a surgeon chose instruments. How did Thorne get involved? Accident, apparently. The girl flagged his convoy on the forest road. He played hero. Thorne doesn't play anything. No, Daly agreed. He doesn't, which means he's either going to walk away once he gets bored or he's going to dig. And if he digs, then he finds what the waitress found. And then we have a much larger problem than a missing $3,000. The voice on the other end was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke again, the warmth had gone out of it entirely. I've worked too long and sacrificed too much to let a waitress and a crime lord unravel everything. Handle it, Vincent. I don't care how, but handle it before my name surfaces. Daly swirled the scotch in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. I already sent a team to Thorne's safe house, and they failed. 4 men, 2 dead, 2 neutralized, trying to reach their vehicle. The silence that followed was colder than anything the forest had produced that morning. Then stop sending boys and start thinking, the voice said. You know what Thorne's weakness is. The same weakness he's always had. The same reason he stopped for that girl in the first place. Daly waited. He saves people, the voice continued. Broken women, damaged children. It's pathological. He can't help himself. It's the wound he keeps reopening because he thinks if he saves enough strangers, it'll make up for the one person he couldn't save. The voice paused. Use it. If Thorne won't leave the Holloway woman alone, then make the Holloway woman the reason he falls. The call ended. Daly set down his phone and looked at the floor behind the bar downstairs, where the safe sat beneath its floorboard, holding the ledger that contained names, dates, amounts, and relationships that could bring down careers, destroy families, and end lives. Grace Holloway had seen that book, had seen enough to understand its significance. And now she was under the protection of the one man in this city who had both the means and the motivation to use it. Daly finished his scotch and set the glass down with a soft click that sounded in the empty office like a period at the end of a sentence. Everyone had a weakness. Thorne's was Mercy. Grace Holloway's was her daughter. And weaknesses properly exploited were more effective than any weapon ever made. He reached for his phone again. The game was just beginning. Grace found Jolene Marsh on a Tuesday morning. It had taken Leon, despite his wounded arm, less than 12 hours to track her down. Jolene had moved from her old apartment 3 weeks ago around the same time Grace had been accused of stealing $3,000 she didn't take. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. Every piece of Jolene's disappearance had been arranged with the same deliberate precision as Grace's destruction. She'd relocated to a small rental house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, 40 minutes east of the city. A quiet street, chain-link fences, yards that had given up trying to be green. The kind of neighborhood where people went when they were hiding from something but couldn't afford to hide well. Dominic offered to send his men. Garrett and Brennan could handle a conversation with a frightened woman faster and more efficiently than Grace could. They'd done it 1,000 times. They knew how to extract information the way dentists knew how to extract teeth, with precision, minimal damage, and complete disregard for the patient's comfort. Grace refused. This one is mine, she said, and the way she said it closed the door on any further discussion. Dominic studied her for a long moment from across the kitchen table of the secondary safe house. The linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting made the space feel temporary, transient, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere more permanent. Wren sat at the table beside her mother, eating cereal with the mechanical focus of a child who had learned that routine was the only reliable anchor in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. She didn't look up when Grace spoke, didn't react, but her spoon paused for half a second, hovering above the bowl before resuming its rhythm. She heard everything, understood more than anyone gave her credit for. I'll drive you, Dominic said. My men will stay with Wren. Grace shook her head. I need to do this alone. She'll talk to me. She won't talk to you. She'll see you and shut down completely. She's right, Leon said from the doorway. His voice was slightly strained from the wound, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Jolene Marsh isn't a criminal. She's a scared woman who got trapped. She sees us. She sees the people who trap. She sees Grace. She sees the friends she betrayed. Guilt is a better lever than fear. Dominic didn't like it. His jaw tightened, the only visible concession to his displeasure. But he'd learned something about Grace Holloway over the past 5 days. She made decisions the way he made decisions, completely irrevocably, and with a clarity that didn't bend under pressure. Leon drives you, Dominic said. He waits in the car. If anything feels wrong, you come out. Grace nodded. She kissed the top of Wren's head, lingering for a moment, breathing in the smell of her daughter's hair, cheap hotel shampoo, and something underneath that was just Wren. The smell that had guided her through the darkness of the oak tree when consciousness tried to leave and her body begged her to let go. I'll be back before lunch, Grace said. Wren looked up. Her eyes were old. Too old. Promise, promise. The drive to Cedar Falls took 37 minutes. Leon drove with one hand, his wounded arm resting on his thigh, his eyes checking the mirrors with the involuntary rhythm of a man who'd spent his entire adult life watching for things coming from behind. Grace sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape change from rural highway to suburban sprawl to the tired edges of a town that had seen better decades. She didn't speak, didn't fidget. Her mind was somewhere between the present and the past, walking through memories of Jolene Marsh that now carried a different weight than they'd had a week ago. Jolene sitting across from her at the diner, laughing at something stupid, coffee going cold between them. Jolene driving Ren to school when Grace's car broke down. Jolene showing up at the apartment with groceries after Grace's hours were cut. Jolene in the emergency room waiting area holding Grace's hand while a doctor explained that Ren's hearing was at risk and the surgery wasn't covered. Jolene, who had heard Grace's desperate confession about the $400 and turned it into a weapon. The house was small and neglected in the way that rental properties in neighborhoods like this always were. Paint peeling from the window frames, a gutter hanging loose on one side, a child's bicycle lying on its side in the front yard, one wheel still spinning lazily in the morning breeze. Grace saw the bicycle and felt something shift inside her chest. A child's bicycle. She got out of the car. Leon watched her walk up the cracked concrete path to the front door. His hand moved to rest on his weapon. Habit, but his eyes carried something else. Something that might have been respect. Grace knocked. Silence inside. Then footsteps. Hesitant. Moving toward the door and then stopping. The sound of someone looking through a peephole and seeing the last person on earth they expected to see. The door didn't open. Jolene, Grace said. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the rage that had been building inside her for days, because rage was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed answers. Answers required conversation. Conversation required control. It's me. I'm alive, and I'm not here to hurt you. Silence stretched for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Grace counted the heartbeats in her own chest. Then the deadbolt turned. The door opened, 3 inches held by a chain lock. Through the gap, Grace saw Jolene's face. The woman she'd called her best friend for 4 years. The woman she'd trusted with the worst secret of her worst moment. Jolene looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes, so deep they looked like bruises. Hair unwashed, pulled back in a careless knot. Weight lost from a frame that hadn't had much to spare. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks, who had been carrying something so heavy it was crushing her one vertebra at a time. "Oh God," Jolene whispered. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks before she could blink them back. "Grace, oh God, you're alive, you're—" Her voice broke into pieces. "Open the door, Jolene. Gaia. I can't. If he finds out I talk to you, open the door." Something in Grace's voice, not threat, not anger, but the absolute unbreakable authority of a woman who had been hung from a tree and lived to walk up this particular path and knock on this particular door, penetrated whatever wall Jolene had built around herself. The chain rattled. The door opened. Grace stepped inside. The house was sparse. Cheap furniture. Boxes still unpacked against the walls. A television playing cartoons at low volume in a room down the hall. And on the kitchen table, visible through the doorway, a child's drawing. Stick figures. A house. A son. The word mommy written in wobbly letters across the top. Jolene's son, 6 years old. The child Grace had babysat a dozen times. The child who called her Auntie Grace and always asked for the same bedtime story about a bear who couldn't find his way home. Jolene stood in the middle of the living room, arms wrapped around herself, shaking. She looked at Grace's wrists, the thin dressing still visible beneath her sleeves, and made a sound that was half sob, half moan. "I'm sorry," she choked. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to. You have to believe me. I didn't want any of it. I tried to find another way. I tried." Grace stood very still. She let Jolene's words wash over her without responding. Let the woman talk. Let the confession build its own momentum, because confessions were like avalanches. Once they started, they only moved in one direction. "He has my son," Jolene said. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, crashing together. "Daily. He took Caleb 3 months ago, said it was a favor, said he'd watch him while I worked extra shifts. But then when I tried to pick him up, his men blocked the door. And Daly called me. He called me and he said," she doubled over, pressing her hands against her knees, hyperventilating. "He said if I did what he asked, Caleb would come home. And if I didn't, Caleb wouldn't come home at all. Not ever." Grace felt the rage inside her shift, not diminish, not disappear, but change shape, redirect. Because the woman in front of her wasn't the architect of her suffering. She was another brick in the wall that Vincent Daly had built to protect himself. "What did he ask you to do?" Grace said. Her voice was steady, level, the voice of someone conducting an interrogation disguised as a conversation. Jolene straightened, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Skim from the register. Small amounts at first. 50 here, 100 there. He said it was a test, to see if I could follow instructions. Then he told me to take more, and to make it look like you were doing it, to change the numbers, to adjust the timestamps on the register logs so it matched your shifts instead of mine. How much total? 2,600 over 6 weeks. He told Daly's accountant it was 3,000. Rounded up for impact. Grace absorbed this. $2,600. The price of a woman's life, the price of hanging someone from a tree and traumatizing a child. It was the kind of number that should have been meaningless to a man like Vincent Daly, who moved hundreds of thousands through his operation every month. But the money had never been the point. He wanted me gone because of what Grace said. The ledger. Jolene nodded miserably. He told me you'd seen something you shouldn't have. He said you were a liability. He said the only way to protect everyone, including me, including Caleb, was to give him a reason to remove you that looked legitimate. A theft, a betrayal of trust, something that justified punishment without raising questions. And you believed him. Jolene's face crumpled. I believed he'd kill my son. That's what I believed, because he showed me a photograph of Caleb sleeping in a room I'd never seen, and he said if I didn't cooperate, that room would be the last place my son ever slept. The silence that followed was so complete that Grace could hear the cartoon playing in the other room. A character laughing, bright, artificial. Grace looked at Jolene Marsh, her friend, her betrayer, a mother whose child had been weaponized against her by a man who understood that love was the most exploitable vulnerability in the human condition. Where is Caleb now? Grace asked. Jolene shook her head. I don't know. They moved him after what they did to you. Daly called me the next day and said the job was done and Caleb would come home soon. But soon turned into days. Days turned into a week. I've called 11 times. No one answers. I don't know if my son is. She couldn't finish the sentence. Grace stood there for a long time, watching her friend fall apart, feeling the rage and the grief and the understanding collide inside her chest like weather systems creating something entirely new. She thought about what it would feel like to have someone take Ren, to sit in a rental house with unpacked boxes and a child's bicycle in the yard and not know if her daughter was alive or dead, to have that uncertainty eat through every thought, every breath, every second of every day, until the only thing left was the hollow shell of a person who'd do anything, betray anyone to make it stop. I won't forgive you, Grace said finally. Jolene looked up, her face ravaged by tears and exhaustion. I won't forgive you for what happened to me, for what happened to my daughter, for what Ren saw and what she'll carry for the rest of her life. That's mine and it's hers and it doesn't go away because you had reasons. Jolene nodded, accepting this the way a condemned person accepts a sentence. But I won't let him use your son the way he used my daughter, Grace continued. And there was something in her voice now that was larger than rage, larger than mercy, something that encompassed both and transcended either. We're going to get Caleb back, and we're going to end this. How? Jolene's voice was barely a whisper. Grace held up her wrists. The thin dressings were slightly worn now, but beneath them the wounds were healing. New skin was growing over the places where rope had cut to bone. I'm going back to the Paradise Club, Grace said, and I'm going to take the one thing Vincent Daly can't afford to lose. The plan came together over the next 48 hours. Grace presented it to Dominic in the kitchen of the secondary safe house with Leon and Garrett listening from the doorway. She'd thought through every detail with the meticulous care of someone who understood that the margin for error was measured in her daughter's safety. Daly's club closed at 2 a.m. on weeknights. By 2:30, the staff was gone. Daly himself stayed late on Thursdays, the night he met with Briggs to review the legitimate books, but he left by 3. Between 3 and 6 a.m., the club sat empty, except for one security guard who monitored cameras from a back office and made hourly rounds. Grace knew the guard's name, his schedule, his habits. She knew that at 4:15 every night he left his station to smoke in the alley behind the kitchen entrance, because the security cameras had a blind spot there that Daly had never bothered to fix. She knew the layout of the bar, the position of the floorboard that concealed the safe, the combination she'd memorized from watching Daly's reflection in the office window. Four numbers, left 17, right 42, left 8, right 31. She'd practiced the sequence on a combination lock Leon had provided until her fingers could execute it in darkness by touch alone in under 10 seconds. The plan was simple. Simple plans survive contact with reality. Complex plans collapsed under their own weight. Grace would enter through the kitchen entrance during the guard's smoke break, cross the club floor to the bar, access the floor safe, remove the ledger, exit the way she came. Total time inside the building under 4 minutes. Dominic's men would maintain positions outside, Garrett at the front, Brennan covering the alley. Leon, despite his injury, monitoring communications from the vehicle. Dominic himself would be positioned at the rear entrance, the closest point to Grace's exit route. If anything went wrong, if Daly had changed the combination, if additional security had been added, if the guard deviated from his routine, Grace would abort. No heroics, no improvisation. Out the door, into Dominic's hands. Gone. That was the plan Grace presented. That was not the plan the universe honored. Thursday arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes irreversible things. The air was cold and dry, the sky moonless. The streets surrounding the Paradise Club empty, except for the occasional taxi carrying someone home from somewhere they shouldn't have been. Grace sat in the back seat of the vehicle parked 2 blocks south of the club. She wore dark clothing, black pants, black jacket, soft-soled shoes that made no sound on concrete. She'd removed the outer layer of gauze that afternoon, leaving only thin adhesive strips over the wounds. She needed her fingers free, needed to feel the combination lock's resistance, its subtle clicks, the difference between almost and open. Leon sat in the driver's seat, his wounded arm functional enough to drive but not enough to fight effectively. His weapon rested on the center console. His eyes moved between the mirrors and the club's silhouette. Garrett's voice came through the earpiece. Front clear. No movement. Lights are off except the back office. Guard is at his station. Brennan followed. Alley clear. Kitchen entrance is unlocked. Same as last 3 nights. Dominic's voice was last. Steady, low. Grace, you have the route memorized. Every step, she replied. Her voice was calm. Her hands were steady. The fear was there, swimming beneath the surface, but she'd made peace with it the way soldiers make peace with mortality. Not by eliminating it, by incorporating it. 4:15, Dominic said. That's your window. 4 minutes inside, not a second more. If anything deviates from the plan, you come to me. Understood. Understood. The minutes crawled. Grace watched the dashboard clock change numbers with the painful slowness of a hospital waiting room. 4:08, 4:09, 4:10. Each minute lasted a year. Each second carried the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The $400 the surgery, the door left open 6 inches, the reflection in the office window, the rope around her wrist, the tree, the fog, the little girl running barefoot toward a convoy of black cars. All of it converging on this. 4:13. Guard is moving, Garrett reported, heading toward the kitchen. Grace's hand found the door handle. 4:14. Kitchen door opening. He's lighting up. Alley position confirmed. He's settled. Grace opened the car door. The night air hit her face cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and old grease from the club's kitchen ventilation. Go, Dominic said. Grace moved. She crossed the 2 blocks in 90 seconds, staying close to building walls, avoiding the sparse pools of light from street lamps that hadn't been maintained in years. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the pavement. Her breathing was controlled. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The rhythm Leon had taught her. Combat breathing. The alley behind the Paradise Club smelled like stale beer and dumpster rot. Grace pressed herself against the brick wall and edged toward the kitchen entrance. 20 feet away, around the corner, she could hear the guard exhaling cigarette smoke and scrolling through his phone. The tiny electronic sounds of a social media feed. Mundane. Ordinary. Grace slipped through the kitchen door. The interior of the Paradise Club was different in darkness. During operating hours, the place thrummed with energy music voices, the clatter of glasses, and the mechanical shuffle of cards from the back rooms. Now it was a tomb. silent, still, the air heavy with the ghost of 1,000 nights of smoke and sweat and desperation. Grace moved through the kitchen past stainless steel counters that caught fragments of light from the exit sign above the door. Through the service hallway where she'd walked 1,000 times carrying trays of drinks. Past the office door closed now dark, she emerged onto the club floor, tables and chairs stacked along the walls. The bar stretched across the far-sided mahogany gleaming dully in the ambient light from the security panel's green glow near the front entrance. Grace vaulted the bar with a smoothness that surprised her. Muscle memory from months of ducking behind it during rushes. Her feet landed silently on the rubber mat. She crouched and ran her fingers along the floorboards, counting from the register. Third board from the left, fourth from the wall. The one with a slightly different grain pattern. She found it in 8 seconds. Her fingernails caught the edge, and she lifted it carefully, the board coming up with a faint creak that sounded enormous in the silence. Beneath it, the floor safe sat in a cavity carved into the concrete foundation. Cold metal. A combination dial that caught the faint green light. Grace placed her fingers on the dial. Left 17, the dial turned smoothly. Click. Right 42. Her fingers moved with the precision she drilled into them over 2 days of practice. Left 8. One more, right 31. The safe made a sound, a soft mechanical exhale as the locking mechanism released. Grace pulled the handle and the door swung open. The black leather ledger sat on top of a stack of cash. Thick, heavy, the leather was cracked and worn at the edges from years of handling. Grace reached in and pulled it out, tucked it inside her jacket, pressing it flat against her ribs, feeling its weight against her body like a second heartbeat. She closed the safe, replaced the floorboard, stood up behind the bar, and Vincent Daly said her name. Grace. The voice came from the darkness near the office hallway. Calm, conversational. The voice of a man who had been expecting her and had the patience to wait until the precise moment that would cause the maximum psychological impact. A light clicked on, the small lamp on the corner table near the stage casting a warm circle of illumination that revealed Daly sitting in a leather armchair, his legs crossed, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie. His face was pleasant, almost friendly. Beside him stood a man Grace didn't recognize. Tall, heavy, and arms folded across a chest that strained against a black tactical vest. A weapon holstered visibly on his hip. Something professional and cold. I wondered how long it would take, Daly said. He swirled his drink. The answer, it turns out, is 6 days, faster than I expected, slower than Thorne's reputation suggested. Grace stood behind the bar, the ledger pressed against her ribs, her mind executing rapid calculations. The kitchen exit was 30 feet behind her. The front door was locked. And between her and every exit stood a man with a gun who hadn't been part of any surveillance report. She'd been expected. The plan had been anticipated. And she was alone inside a building with the man who had ordered her hung from a tree. Don't bother with the kitchen, Daly said, reading her thoughts. Jenkins is outside. He's been outside since midnight, waiting for exactly this. The guard's smoke break was real, by the way. I just made sure you knew about it. Routine is such a useful weapon when someone is watching. Grace's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She looked at Vincent Daly across the empty club floor and felt the fear rise inside her like floodwater. But she stood on higher ground now. She'd been to the worst place fear could take her. She'd hung from a tree and watched the world go dark. Everything since then was just weather. You knew I'd come, she said. I knew Thorne would send someone. I assumed it would be one of his men. Finding out it's you is. Daly paused, considering. Poetic. The waitress returns to the scene of the crime. $400 to save my daughter's hearing, Grace said, which you turned into $3,000 and used as an excuse to kill me, not kill. Daly raised a corrective finger. Punish. There's a distinction. If I'd wanted you dead, you'd have been dead. I wanted a spectacle. A message. Something memorable enough to ensure that nobody else who worked in this club ever thought about looking through doors that should have been closed. He set down his glass and stood. The armed man beside him didn't move. Didn't need to. Daly walked toward the bar with the unhurried confidence of a man on his own territory. He stopped 10 feet from Grace. You saw the ledger, he said. 3 months ago. Through the office window. I knew within the hour. Briggs saw your face, and I thought to myself, what do you do with a waitress who's seen the bones of your operation? He spread his hands. You can't promote her. You can't trust her silence. You can't let her walk away carrying information that could destroy careers and end lives. So you create cause. You manufacture a debt. You inflate the numbers. You give yourself justification that on paper looks proportionate. He was standing at the bar now. Close, his cologne was expensive. Understated. Fear is cheaper than payroll, Daly said. Do you know what that means? It means that one public punishment prevents 100 private betrayals. It means that hanging you from that tree cost me 4 men and some rope, but it saved me the cost of wondering who else might be paying attention to things they shouldn't see. Grace stared at him. This man who spoke about hanging her from a tree with the same detached analysis other men used to discuss quarterly earnings. This man who had taken Jolene's son to ensure cooperation. Who had built a system of leverage and fear so comprehensive that the people inside it couldn't distinguish between choices and compulsions. She felt the ledger against her ribs, heavy with names and numbers in the architecture of corruption. You took Jolene's son, Grace said. Collateral. Every negotiation requires collateral. Jolene was useful, cooperative. All she needed was motivation, and motherhood provides the most reliable motivation in existence. You'd understand that better than most. The implication hung in the air. Grace felt it settle on her skin. Is he alive? Grace asked. The boy is fine, comfortable, watched by competent people. He'll be returned when his mother's usefulness expires, or when the situation resolves itself. Whichever comes first. And me, what resolves my situation? Daly tilted his head, studying her with clinical interest. Give me back the ledger, Daly said. Walk away, take your daughter, leave the state. And this ends. No more men in the woods. No more attacks. No more Dominic Thorne playing savior. Grace almost laughed. The sound formed in her chest but died before it reached her throat. Walk away, as if walking away from a man like Daly was something you did once and never had to do again. As if the fear ever actually stopped. People who have nothing left to lose don't scare, Grace said. Everyone has something to lose, Daly replied. And everyone who says otherwise is lying. You have a daughter. That's something. That's everything. The words landed like a blade. Because he was right. Ren was everything. Ren was the reason she'd stolen $400. The reason she'd survived the tree. The reason she was standing in this club at 4 a.m. with a stolen ledger pressed against her body and a man with a gun watching her. Ren was the reason for everything. And Ren was also the reason Grace couldn't hand back the ledger and walk away. Because walking away meant living in fear. And living in fear meant raising Ren in fear. And raising Ren in fear meant that the men who had laughed while they strung Grace up from a tree had won, had gotten exactly what they wanted, had proven that people like Grace and Ren didn't matter, that nobody would care. No, Grace said. The word was quiet, simple, complete. Daly's pleasant expression cooled. He studied her with the focused attention of a man reassessing a variable he'd miscalculated. That's unfortunate, he said. He turned toward the armed man. Because now we do this differently. Grace's earpiece crackled to life. Dominic's voice. Calm. Controlled. But carrying an undercurrent she'd never heard before. Something electric and dangerous. Kitchen door. Now. Move. The armed man reached for his weapon. Grace dropped behind the bar. The front door of the Paradise Club exploded inward. Not kicked, not forced. Blown off its hinges by a breaching charge that turned solid wood into splinters and filled the room with a concussive wave that knocked bottles off shelves and sent Daly stumbling sideways. Dominic came through the smoke. He moved differently than Grace had ever seen him move. Every other time he'd been controlled, measured. Now he moved with velocity, purpose. The coiled energy of something that had been restraining itself for too long and had finally been given permission to stop. Garrett came through behind him, then Brennan. The armed man by Daly's side got his weapon halfway up before Garrett's hand clamped around his wrist and twisted with mechanical efficiency. The gun clattered to the floor. The man followed it. Dominic didn't stop moving until he was standing directly in front of Vincent Daly. The two men faced each other across 3 feet of charged air. Daly, for the first time since Grace had known him, looked uncertain. Not afraid, not yet, but uncertain. The expression of a man who had planned for every contingency except the one standing in front of him. Thorne, Daly said. His voice maintained its composure, but the edges were fraying. This is my establishment, my territory. Dominic said nothing. He stood there, weapon at his side, his dark eyes fixed on Daly with the patient intensity of something that had been watching from the tree line and had finally decided to step into the clearing. Grace rose from behind the bar, the ledger still pressed against her body. She moved around the bar and walked across the club floor until she stood beside Dominic. Not behind him, beside him. Daly's eyes moved between them. This is sentimental, Daly said, and contempt entered his voice. Finding it there felt like finding solid ground. The crime lord and the waitress. Is this how you spend your time now, Thorne? Rescuing strays, playing knight to damsels in distress. Dominic still said nothing. Daly pressed. I know about you. I know more than you think. I know why you stopped for that girl on the road. Why you couldn't just drive past. You think I don't do my research. His voice dropped lower, harder. Her name was Sophia, your sister. 8 years old when she died, beaten by men your family owed money to. And nobody stopped it. Nobody intervened. Nobody cared about one more dead girl in one more forgotten neighborhood. And you've spent your entire life trying to balance that scale, saving every broken woman, every damaged child, trying to fill a hole that can't be filled because the girl who made it is gone and she's never coming back. The silence that followed was absolute. Something behind Dominic's eyes shifted, not cracking, not breaking, deeper. The movement of tectonic plates far below the surface where the heat was greatest and the pressure was most intense. Grace watched his jaw tighten, watched his hand flex once around the grip of his weapon, watched the cost of Daly's words register in the barely visible tremor that ran through the muscles of his neck. She saw what Daly had intended, the psychological strike designed to destabilize, to make Dominic emotional, to make him sloppy, to turn his greatest strength into a vulnerability. And she saw it working. Not completely, not enough to break Dominic Thorne. Nothing would ever be enough for that, but enough to create a crack. Enough to make the silence last 1 second longer than it should have. Enough to give Daly hope that his gambit had found its target. Grace stepped forward. She stepped in front of Dominic. Between the two men, facing Daly, her back to the man who had saved her life, shielding him the way he had shielded her daughter in the forest clearing 6 days ago. You're right, Grace said to Daly. Her voice was clear, strong, carrying across the ruined club with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak by surviving everything this man had thrown at her. He saved me because of his sister, because of a wound he carries, because he couldn't save her and he spent his life making sure that absence means something. She took another step toward Daly. But here's what you don't understand. He saved me, and I'm saving myself. That's the difference between us and you. We don't break alone. You use people's love against them. You took Jolene's son. You used my daughter. You exploit the fact that people care about each other, and you think that makes them weak. But you're wrong. It makes them dangerous. Because a person fighting for someone they love will walk into places that terrify them, will stand in front of men who want them dead, will come back to the building where their death was ordered and take back the one thing that can end it all. She pulled the ledger from inside her jacket and held it up. Daly's eyes locked on the black leather book with the involuntary focus of a man watching his own destruction take physical form. Every name, Grace said, every payment, every official you've bought, every crime you have documented in your own handwriting because you were too arrogant to believe a waitress would ever matter enough to use it against you. She turned and handed the ledger to Dominic. Their eyes met, and in that exchange something passed between them that was simpler and more powerful than gratitude or respect. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one survivor by another, the understanding that some debts weren't measured in money and some balances couldn't be restored, but the attempt to restore them anyway was what made the difference between existing and living. Dominic took the ledger. His hand closed around it, and his eyes moved from Grace to Daly with the slow, deliberate focus of a predator that had been patient long enough. Where is the boy? Dominic said. His voice was quiet, controlled. but the temperature beneath the words would have frozen steel. Jolene Marsh's son. Where is he? Daly's composure splintered further. He looked at the ledger in Dominic's hand, looked at Grace standing with her healing wrists and her unbowed spine, looked at Garrett and Brennan positioned at the exits, and he made the calculation that men like him eventually always made. The math didn't work anymore. Warehouse, Daly said. His voice had gone flat. Empty. Industrial district. Unit 14. 2 men watching him. He's unharmed. If he's not, Dominic said, this conversation continues somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Daly didn't respond. There was nothing left to respond with. The empire he'd built on fear and leverage had just been dismantled by a waitress and a crime lord who'd met by accident on a foggy road 6 days ago. Dominic looked at Garrett. Go. Take Brennan. Bring the boy to his mother. Garrett moved without hesitation. Brennan followed. The club's front entrance, now missing its door, let in the cold night air as they disappeared into the darkness. Dominic turned back to Daly. Grace watched what happened next from the doorway of the kitchen. She'd made her choice. She'd walked into the building. She'd faced the man who tried to kill her. She'd taken the ledger. She'd said the words that needed saying. The rest belonged to Dominic Thorne, and the rest was not something she needed to witness. She stepped through the kitchen door and into the alley where the night air tasted clean after the stale interior of the club. Leon was waiting at the end of the alley, the vehicle running, his eyes scanning the street. You got it, he said. I got it. And Daly, Dominic is finishing things. Leon nodded. He didn't ask for details. 7 years of working with Dominic Thorne had taught him that some conversations had conclusions that didn't require narration. Grace got into the vehicle and closed her eyes. She pressed her wrists together in her lap and breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The rhythm steadied. The heartbeat slowed. The adrenaline that had been carrying her for the past 30 minutes began to recede, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like being submerged in warm water. She'd done it. The Paradise Club would never open again. The ledger would find its way to people who would use it to dismantle every corrupt connection Daly had built. The alderman, whoever he was, would discover that the bones of his arrangement had been exhumed and laid out in the daylight, where they could no longer be denied. And Vincent Daly's conversation with Dominic Thorne would be his last conversation with anyone. Some lessons only needed to be taught once. Caleb Marsh was recovered from the warehouse at 5:47 in the morning. Garrett found him sleeping on a cot in a back room, watched by 2 men who surrendered without resistance when presented with the alternative. The boy was thin, frightened, but unharmed. He asked for his mother before Garrett had finished clearing the building. They brought him to Jolene at the Cedar Falls house as the sun was coming up. Grace watched from the vehicle as Jolene opened her front door and saw her son standing on the cracked concrete path, a live hole blinking in the early light with the confused expression of a child waking from a dream he didn't understand. Jolene made a sound, not a word, not a scream, something deeper than both. She dropped to her knees and pulled Caleb against her chest and held him the way Grace had held Wren in the steel room of the safe house, with the desperate, crushing, life-affirming force of a mother reclaiming the most important thing in her world. Grace watched for a long time. Then she told Leon to drive. The days that followed moved quickly. Dominic's network operated with the quiet efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this kind of restructuring. Documents were prepared. Housing was arranged. Employment was secured. The mechanics of disappearance, of starting over, of becoming new people in a new place, unfolded with a professionalism that suggested Dominic had done this before. Probably many times. People who needed to vanish. People who deserved a second chance. People whose survival required distance from the places and persons who had tried to destroy them. Grace and Wren were given a house 3 hours north of the city, small town, quiet streets, a school for Wren that had a music program, and a library with a reading nook shaped like a castle. A restaurant management position for Grace that paid enough to live on and came with health insurance that covered everything. Everything. Jolene and Caleb were relocated separately, different town, different direction, far enough from Grace that proximity wouldn't reopen wounds, close enough that someday, maybe if enough time passed and enough healing happened, a bridge might be built. Or might not. Grace hadn't decided. Some decisions needed years. not days. The morning they left the safe house, Wren packed her bag with the serious concentration of a child who understood that everything she owned fit in a single backpack and had made peace with that fact. She placed Leon's suit jacket, which he'd never asked for, back at the top, folded carefully, kept like a talisman. She asked to say goodbye to Dominic. He wasn't there. Grace had expected this, had understood perhaps before Dominic himself understood it, that he wouldn't be present for the departure. Goodbyes created attachments. Attachments created complications. And Dominic Thorne's architecture of survival depended on clean lines and clear boundaries and the discipline to maintain distance even when closing, it would feel better. Leon drove them north. 3 hours of highway passing through landscapes that grew quieter and greener as the city fell behind. Wren slept for the first hour, her head against her mother's shoulder, her breathing deep and even for the first time in over a week. Grace stayed awake, watching the road, watching the horizon, watching the distance grow between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The apartment was on the second floor of a building that smelled like fresh paint and possibility. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that faced east catching the morning sun, a living room with enough space for a couch and a bookshelf, and the small daily routines that constituted a life. Wren explored every room with the cautious optimism of someone entering a space that might be safe but wasn't yet certain. She tested light switches, opened cabinets, stood at the bedroom window, and looked out at a street lined with maple trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold. "Mom," she said. "Yeah, baby, I think I like it here." Grace stood beside her daughter and looked out at the maple trees and the quiet street and the ordinary, beautiful, unremarkable world that stretched out before them like a promise she finally believed. "I think I like it here too," she said. Leon left after carrying their bags upstairs. He shook Grace's hand at the door, and in that handshake was everything that couldn't be spoken. Gratitude, respect, the acknowledgement of a shared experience that had bonded them in ways that normal life couldn't replicate. "Take care of yourself," Leon said. "And that one," he nodded toward Wren, who was arranging her backpack contents on the bedroom floor with architectural precision. "She's something special." "I know," Grace said. Leon was halfway to the car when Wren appeared at the apartment door. "Mr. Leon," he turned. "Tell Mr. Thorne I said thank you. Tell him." Wren hesitated, searching for the right words with the intensity she brought to everything. "Tell him that I know he couldn't save his sister, but he saved my mom. And that counts. That counts just as much." Leon stood in the parking lot for a long moment, looking up at this small girl framed in the doorway of her new life, holding the battered remains of a dusty rose dress that she had carried in her backpack all the way from the forest. "I'll tell him," Leon said. He drove away. Grace closed the door and locked it, not from fear but from habit. The habits would change eventually. The locks would become routine instead of refuge. The sounds of the night would lose their menace. The dreams would soften. The scars on her wrists would fade to thin white lines, and one day Wren would be old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened on that forest road and choose what to do with the memory. Survive. Grow stronger. Make sure no one ever has that kind of power over you again. Grace sat on the kitchen floor because they didn't have chairs yet, and Wren sat beside her and they ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because the grocery store was closed and the cabinets were empty, and it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the fact that they were here, alive, together, in a kitchen with a window that faced east. Wren fell asleep on the living room floor wrapped in Leon's suit jacket, and Grace carried her to bed and tucked her in and stood in the doorway listening to her daughter breathe. Her phone buzzed, a photo from a number she didn't recognize. Wren's handwriting on a piece of paper, the thank you note she'd written at the safe house and asked Leon to deliver. The image had been forwarded without comment. Below the photo, a single line of text. "The ledger has been delivered to the appropriate people. The alderman has been identified. His name will be in the newspapers within the week. You're safe. Both of you." Grace typed a response. 3 words. Not enough. Too much. The only thing that mattered. "Thank you, Dominic." She waited. No response came. She hadn't expected one. Somewhere south of the city on a stretch of forest road that looked different in daylight, a black vehicle idled on the shoulder. Dominic Thorne sat in the back seat, his phone in his hand, Grace's message glowing on the screen. He read it once, saved the photo of Wren's note, powered the device off. Garrett met his eyes in the rearview mirror. Back to the city, boss. Yes. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, leaving the forest road behind. The fog was gone. The morning was clear. The oak tree in the clearing still stood, its branches spreading wide rope marks visible if you looked closely enough. But nobody was looking. The cruelty had been answered. The balance, however imperfect, had been restored. And two people who should have been destroyed by violence had instead been forged by it into something stronger than they'd been before. Grace Holloway stood at her kitchen window the next morning, watching the sun rise over maple trees, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Behind her, Wren slept peacefully for the first time in 10 days. No nightmares, no reaching out in the dark. Just sleep, deep and clean and earned. Grace breathed. The road behind them remembered everything. It always would. But memory without consequence was just history, and history belonged to whoever survived long enough to write it. Grace and Wren Holloway had survived, and that was the only history that mattered. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down in the comments.